What if even the Beatles producer couldn't save you from your own success? Four Midwestern misfits hid in mail trucks fleeing thousands of screaming Japanese fans. A live album intended only for Japan went triple platinum and made them legends. Then their bassist quit. George Martin's magic couldn't stop the slide. They stomped on a cassette that became their only #1 hit. Every album after was measured against Two Electric Nights in Tokyo. This is the rise and fall of Cheap Trick. Rockford, Illinois, late 1960s. If you wanted to make it in rock and roll, this was about the worst place you could start. No record labels, no media connections, no coastal glamour. Just the industrial heartland of Middle America and the belief that maybe, just maybe, a group of kids from the Midwest could challenge the British invasion on its own terms. The architects of what would become Cheap Trick were guitarist Rick Nielsen and bassist Tom Peterson. They'd started together in Fuse, a psychedelic hard rock outfit that released one forgettable album in 1969 before disappearing into obscurity. The failure stung, but it didn't stop them. They relocated to Philadelphia, renamed themselves Sick Man of Europe, and toured Europe unsuccessfully in 1972. When that dream collapsed, they did what survivors do. They went home. Back to Rockford in 1973, back to the grinding club circuit, back to square one. But this time, they had a plan. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Nielsen recruited drummer Brad Carlson, known as Bun E. Carlos, a technical precision player who'd worked with him in local bands like the Grim Reapers. They called themselves Cheap Trick, a name inspired by Peterson's dismissive comment that the British glam band Slade used every cheap trick in the book to get attention. The first lineup featured vocalist Randy Hogan, but interpersonal friction with Peterson ended that quickly. The missing piece arrived in fall 1974. Robin Zander, a Wisconsin-born folk singer with remarkable vocal range and movie star looks that could have landed him in a teen magazine. Now they had something special. Nielsen was the eccentric genius. Bow ties, flipped bill baseball caps, guitars shaped like everything from checkerboards to five-necked monstrosities. Peterson was the pretty boy with the 12-string bass. Zander was the golden-voiced frontman who looked like a rock god. And Carlos, he looked like an accountant who wandered onto stage by mistake. Chain-smoking, mustached, dressed like he was auditing the show rather than playing it. This visual dissonance was deliberate. The irony that a band looking so weird could sound so polished and melodic became their signature. And between 1974 and 1977, they perfected that contradiction through sheer relentless work. Over 200 shows a year in bowling alleys, warehouses, and Midwestern clubs that smelled like stale beer and broken dreams. The grind forged their sound and tested their commitment. Cheap Trick earned it the hard way. By 1977, Cheap Trick had a catalog of original material and the live chops to back it up. Producer Jack Douglas helped them record their self-titled debut. The album was aggressive, dark, and uncompromising, tackling numerous social and societal issues through each song. It was brilliant. Critics loved it. Reviewers heard a band that could fuse Beatles-style melody with raw, almost punk aggression. But US radio found their lyrics too dark and too risky for mainstream playlists. The guitar work was innovative, the songwriting was sharp, everything pointed to breakthrough success, but radio ignored it. Program directors didn't know what to do with songs about such dark subject matter. The album didn't even chart on the Billboard 200. For a band that had spent years grinding through the Midwest club circuit, the silence was crushing. They'd finally gotten their shot at the big time, and nobody was listening. The record label's solution was producer Tom Werman, who emphasized the band's melodic hooks for their second album, In Color, released in September 1977. Werman created a slicker, shinier sound, one that Nielsen and the band openly disparage as too wimpy. The studio version of I Want You to Want Me particularly bothered them. It had a music hall piano arrangement that felt soft, almost saccharine. But something unexpected happened. While In Color only reached number 73 in the US, it exploded in Japan. The band suddenly had a foreign fan base calling them the American Beatles. a label Nielsen thought both flattering and bizarre. The Japanese rock press started using the phrase, and Cheap Trick was conquering a foreign market while their home country barely noticed they existed. The third studio album, Heaven Tonight, released in May 1978, is often regarded as their masterpiece, the perfect synthesis of the debut's darkness with In Color's polish. It yielded their first US charting single, Surrender, which told the story of a kid discovering his parents' secret rock and roll past. The song peaked at number 62, a modest success that suggested American audiences were finally catching on. But Japan had already descended into full-blown Trick mania. April 1978. Cheap Trick flew to Japan for a 6-date headlining tour. What happened next was something none of them were prepared for. 5,000 screaming fans, mostly teenage girls, greeted them at Narita Airport with an intensity that paralleled the Beatles' arrival in the US in 1966. The band members were forced to hide in the back of mail trucks to reach their hotel because taxicabs full of fans were chasing them through the streets. Robin Zander later recalled the surreal moment. "I thought the president must be on the plane. Then he realized the crowd was there for them. The scenes were chaotic and overwhelming. Fans pressed against the windows of their hotel, chanting their names. Security guards struggled to create pathways through the crowds. Rick Nielsen's eccentric image, the bow ties, the checkered guitars, had become iconic in Japan. Tom Peterson was mobbed like a teen idol. The contrast between their American obscurity and Japanese superstardom was almost incomprehensible. For musicians who'd spent years grinding through Midwestern clubs, playing to dozens of indifferent drunks, this was both validation and vertigo. Success had arrived, but not where it was supposed to. Not in New York or Los Angeles or even Chicago, in Tokyo. The disconnect was profound and strange, while American audiences were slowly discovering heaven. Tonight, Japan was treating Cheap Trick like the second coming of the Fab Four. The irony wasn't lost on the band. The shows at the Nippon Budokan on April 28th and 30th were recorded, originally intended as a thank you souvenir for the Japanese market. The energy captured on those tapes was undeniable. The screaming of the Japanese audience was so loud it was almost frightening to the band. It created a sonic atmosphere that the studio recordings had never captured. Raw, urgent, alive. When Cheap Trick at Budokan was released in Japan in October 1978, something unexpected started happening back in the US. Radio stations and record stores began seeing unprecedented demand for the higher-priced import version. Approximately 30,000 import copies were sold in America before the record label realized they were losing revenue to their own Japanese subsidiary. The dam was about to break. In February 1979, they released Cheap Trick at Budokan domestically, and it became a phenomenon. The live version of I Want You to Want Me replaced the studio's wimpy piano with a hard rock edge and Zander's soaring vocals. The song captured everything that had been missing from the studio version: urgency, power, the communion between band and audience. It climbed to number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100. The album itself peaked at number 4 on the Billboard 200 and went triple platinum. Cheap Trick was suddenly everywhere. Radio ruled their sound. Television showcases and magazine covers turned them into stars. Within months, they were headlining arenas coast to coast. The transformation was dizzying. One month they were opening for other bands and theaters. The next month they were headlining sold-out arenas from coast to coast. The financial pressure that had defined their entire career vanished overnight. This was pure triumph. The outsiders had won. The Midwest had produced something that could compete with anything coming from the coasts or across the Atlantic. Surrender became an anthem. Ain't That a Shame, their cover of the Fats Domino classic, hit number 35. Cheap Trick wasn't just a band anymore. They were a cultural force. But here's where the story takes its tragic turn. Because the thing that made them superstars also became the cage they could never escape. At Budokan created a specific expectation in the minds of millions of new fans. Cheap Trick was now defined as a live band that specialized in high-energy, pop-inflected rock. The darker, more experimental material from their debut, the artistic ambitions that had driven them from the beginning, those didn't matter anymore. The audience wanted Budokan. They wanted that sound, that energy, that specific version of the band, frozen in time on 2 nights in Tokyo. And every album Cheap Trick released afterward would be measured against a moment that couldn't be recreated. The peak was also the trap. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing erosion, album by album, expectation by expectation. Dream Police, released in 1979, had actually been recorded before Budokan became a hit, but its release was delayed for nearly a year to capitalize on the live album's momentum. By the time it came out, the public was hungry for the next Cheap Trick album. Dream Police reached number 6 and featured massive hits like the title track and Voices, but it felt like a retreat into high-production artifice rather than the raw energy the public now associated with the band. The songs were good, some would argue great, but they weren't Budokan. Then came the decision that would define their creative identity crisis, working with George Martin. The legendary producer of the Beatles was Rick Nielsen's dream collaborator, but the record label was skeptical. They wanted the band to stick with Tom Werman's hit-making formula. Cheap Trick pushed forward anyway, believing that Martin's involvement would elevate them to a new artistic level. All Shook Up, released in 1980, was experimental, quirky, and commercially divisive. Songs like Stop This Game featured an ominous, faded-in opening chord. World's Greatest Lover was described by Martin as very Lennon-ish. Who Da King had percussion and chanting that might have been inspired by Fleetwood Mac's Tusk. It was interesting. It was ambitious. It was everything Cheap Trick wanted to be. And the public rejected it. No top 40 hits. The album failed to connect. The audience that had fallen in love with Budokan wasn't ready for Cheap Trick's art rock phase, but the worst was yet to come. During the All Shook Up sessions, Tom Peterson, one of the founding members, the visual anchor, the 12-string bass pioneer, became disillusioned with the music business and the band's direction. Rick Nielsen later suggested that tensions with Peterson's wife worsened the fracture, though others close to the band dispute how much she influenced his departure. In August 1980, Peterson quit. He didn't even show up for the final mixing sessions in England, returning to Los Angeles to pursue a short-lived solo career. This was the end of the classic era. The visual and sonic balance of the quartet was permanently altered. Peterson was replaced first by Pete Comita, then by John Brandt, but it wasn't the same. The band entered survival mode. The 1980s were brutal. Cheap Trick released album after album, One on One in 1982, Next Position Please in 1983, Standing on the Edge in 1985, The Doctor in 1986, and watched each one deliver diminishing returns. They became hard-working journeymen, touring relentlessly, but losing their grip on the cultural conversation. MTV had arrived, and the music industry was changing. Hair metal, synth pop, slick production. The landscape that had briefly elevated Cheap Trick was moving on without them. The venues got smaller, the crowds thinned out. Radio stations that had once championed them moved them to classic rock rotation, the industry's polite way of saying, "You're yesterday's news." The band that had headlined arenas in 1979 was now playing theaters and clubs, watching younger bands fill the stadiums they had once commanded. By 1988, the band was nearly bankrupt. The record executives delivered an ultimatum: make a hit record or you're dropped. For the first time in their career, Cheap Trick was forced to work with outside professional songwriters. This was a crushing blow to Rick Nielsen's pride. He'd spent his entire career writing the band's material, crafting their identity, refusing to compromise. Now, he had no choice. Label executives presented them with 2 ballads, The Flame and Look Away. Nielsen famously expressed his disgust by yanking the cassette of The Flame from the player and grinding it under his boot heel. Drummer Bun E. Carlos recalled they chose The Flame simply because it wasn't as bad as the other option. The irony was devastating. The Flame reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1988, the band's only chart-topping single. Meanwhile, the song they rejected, Look Away, was given to Chicago and also went to number 1. Lap of Luxury returned the band to platinum status and arena tours. They were back on top, but it felt hollow. They were playing someone else's game now, singing someone else's songs. The irreverent outliers from Rockford who'd built everything on their own terms had been forced to compromise to survive. Success had returned, but it came at a cost they'd spent their entire career trying to avoid. By the early 1990s, the corporate pop of lap of luxury had run its course. Cheap Trick was dropped and entered a long period as an independent touring entity. They were no longer driving the cultural conversation. They were playing state fairs and casinos, performing the hits for audiences who wanted to relive their youth. The irony was stark. The band that had once filled arenas was now playing intimate venues, often to crowds more interested in nostalgia than new material. They released albums that barely registered on the charts. Critics who'd once championed them had moved on to covering the next generation of rock bands. The music industry machine that had elevated them to superstardom had chewed them up and spit them out. But something unexpected happened. The leaders of the 1990s alternative rock movement started citing Cheap Trick as a primary influence. Kurt Cobain of Nirvana often described Nirvana's sound as like Cheap Trick with more distortion. Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins praised the band, even borrowing riffs for hits like Cherub Rock. The grunge generation, the bands that had replaced Cheap Trick on the charts, considered them legends. Suddenly, the band that mainstream radio had forgotten was being name-checked by the biggest rock acts of the decade. Pearl Jam covered their songs in concert. Soundgarden praised their influence. The Seattle scene that dominated MTV in the early 90s traced its lineage directly back to Rockford, Illinois. This validation was bittersweet. Cheap Trick was no longer cool to the pop charts, but they were gods to the people who mattered. The songs outlasted the trends. The influence endured even when the commercial success didn't. The ultimate validation arrived in 2016 with their induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The classic lineup, Xander, Nielsen, Peterson, and Carlos, performed together for the first time since 2010. Despite internal drama and legal battles, they made nice for the ceremony, delivering high-energy versions of I Want You to Want Me and Surrender. For the audience who'd followed them since the beginning, who'd bought Budokan on vinyl and worn it out playing it over and over, this was closure. The band that had been trapped by one perfect moment was finally being recognized for everything they had accomplished across 5 decades. Cheap Trick proved that the greatest triumphs can become the traps we never escape. At Budokan elevated them to legend status and locked them in place forever, chasing one perfect Tokyo night for the rest of their careers. But the songs endured, the influence spread, and decades later, they remain proof that talent, grit, and every Cheap Trick in the book can sustain a career even when the industry moves on. What's your favorite Cheap Trick memory? Drop it in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from rock's golden era.